September 11th was an interesting day for me. The day before, we'd had a huge 5-alarm fire, and we had, did not get a live shot up, and all the things, I guess, that seemed really important the day before and even the morning of, suddenly, after that happened, weren't. So I remember I was in the newsroom and I was talking to the photographer who had done the live shot the day before. And we were like, oh, you know, we failed that, we didn't get the shot up, we were so upset. And it just seemed like at that moment that was the most important thing in the world. And then at the assignment desk they have what we call squawk boxes. And they are from CNN and ABC, and they tell us what news is going on around the country and what they have coming up on feeds. And we were sitting there and we were talking, and the squawk box said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. So at that time we were in a different newsroom, and the bank of monitors was on the other side of the room from the desk to the right. So you just look over and you can see what's on all the morning shows. And we were like, really? And at that moment, we're thinking it's a little plane, because we're like, how in the world could you hit that, you know, with a big plane? So we're like, oh. So we went over and we looked, and the morning shows were all starting to put it up, but they hadn't quite yet, but they were talking about it until they got their cameras in place and just saying a plane hit, a plane hit. So we're like, oh. So we went over and looked. There weren't that many people in the newsroom at that point because it was early. So there were probably 5 or 6 people in there. So we all went over and we're watching, and the shot popped up. And the photographer that I've been talking to was like, oh, that's no small plane. So we're like, wow. And we're all beginning to think this was a jetliner that had to have done that kind of damage. Because it was already, you could see the hole, you could see the smoke pouring out. We were like, whoa. So at that point we're thinking, gosh, you know, somebody made a really big mistake and hit the World Trade Center. So we're trying to figure out what happened, what's going on, and we're just watching the monitors. More people started to come into the room, and by this time, I think there were probably 15 people, and people had begun to wander in and were watching with us. And we watched the second plane hit, and everybody, it was a stunned silence. Everybody was looking around going, did we just see that? Did we just watch a plane hit the building again, the other building? And everybody was just like, whoa. And the operations manager at the time was standing next to me, and he bolted for what we call our sky cam. And he was like, we're under attack. They could hit our skyline. And everybody was looking around going, oh my gosh, you know, we are. And so he trained our sky cam onto our buildings downtown, because we didn't know. We were like, oh my goodness. And then that started a whole flow of, now we got to start covering this, we're under attack, what are we going to do, how are we going to do it? The news director jumped into action, got what we call our whiteboard. We rolled it into the newsroom, because at that time we had our morning meeting in a different room out of the newsroom, but we rolled it in. We started calling people in who weren't already there. We're like, everybody get in here, we got to figure out what exactly is going on, because no one knew. All we knew was, whoa, you know, there's just 2 buildings, the World Trade Center just burning, and 2 planes hit them and we're under attack. So we're doing all that. Then of course, the assignment desk phones start to ring crazy, because people are like, what's going on? What are we doing? What's happening? And I think at that moment, as those phones started to ring, and it was nonstop. You couldn't put the phone down. You didn't have to pick up 7 other lines. And I think at that point I realized the media's importance, if you will, to letting people know what's going on. I mean, I knew what we did was important, but that day, it was like, gosh, you know, we have no idea what's happening. We have no idea what could be hit next. And, you know, we're the lifeline to these people. So it was crazy. So we had to bring a bunch of people in to help just answer the phone calls from the public. Then we started to dispatch our crews. We went to the airport, obviously. And we have a member of our staff who is a first responder. He's on a federal team. And he was at work, but he came and had a private conversation and said, I'm going to go to New York. You know, that call's going to come. And I said, well, we'll go, we'll dispatch you, and we'll wait. And when it does come, then we'll make arrangements. And he got to the airport, had just started to shoot his story, and he had to come back. So they were like, he's like, I got that call, I got to go. So we were like, wow. And you have a lot of fears for those people. You know, you're going to send someone into the heart of that mess, and the really, I mean, that was ugly enough, but the other ugly stuff hadn't even happened yet. And we were like, wow. I also remember the city's reaction on the scanners. The assignment desks, they were pretty quiet that morning, but once stuff started to happen, We were right across the street from the main fire headquarters for Cincinnati, and the firemen came out. They were outside, they were looking around. We were like, whoa, you know, what are they doing? And you heard scanner calls for people evacuating downtown Cincinnati buildings. And there was a little confusion between police and fire. What do we do? What do we tell them to do? You know, do we evacuate? Do we just keep people where they are? So there was all this not knowing. And eventually a lot of those businesses decided, and people in them decided, no, we're leaving. You know, we're gonna go home for the day and deal with everything that's going on. So it was quite a day, and I guess the unknown part of it was the biggest part.
Are there any aspects where you feel like what happened on September 11th and kind of aftermath has changed how you do your job as a journalist?
Oh yeah, I would say it's funny how you prioritize things. Like the day, that morning, that live shot was like the most important thing. It was just like, how could we not get that live shot for the 5-alarm fire? And the next day, you know, it was, you know, we thought when the buildings fell, there was another moment in the newsroom where everybody was looking, going, oh my goodness. You know, we thought we had just watched 20,000 people die in that moment. So nothing else about what we were doing really mattered anymore. It was like, wow, you know, wow, could that really happen, and how could that happen? So I think we try to do more relevant stories and more impactful stories and really listen to people about what concerns them. That day I remember too, all the people that were calling in worried about their families, and the staff here, you know, wanting to not, I mean, they're all journalists, but they were concerned about their own families, you know, and they had to make a decision, am I gonna stay here or am I gonna go be with my family because I don't know what's gonna happen next. So it makes you recognize people have lives besides their TV work here. So kind of being mindful of that and recognizing the lives of everybody out there that we serve kind of helps you keep things in perspective. It was also interesting because we were actually documenting history in a way that we had never done before. You know, and we do stories, they're, you know, local stories, but you're really documenting history. People will remember this because of the way that you told them the story. So we have, you know, we can get access to all that. There were cell phone cameras at the time, but not to the degree that there are now. But really how people saw this and how people remembered it and how people lived it might be a little bit up to us. And I think for the first time I recognized the impact that we have. I was like, wow. And now, 10 years later, it's interesting because I have little nieces and nephews who were just born, but they weren't, you know, they didn't know about it, but they're all studying it in school. And it's interesting because my nephew was telling me he was reading a story that I had written about 9/11. And I was like, oh, and they were studying it in school, and he was telling me things that happened that day. And he was like, you know, we learned this and we learned this, and do you know about this? And it was funny because I could tell him, you know, there was a story about a fire chaplain that had died in 9/11, and all he knew was the guy's name. You know, he'd remembered that part, and then I told him the whole story, and he was like, you're right, that's what happened. And it was like, wow, you know, I actually lived that big moment, and so much so that I can almost tell you, you know, what happened because we had documented that history, and now these little kids are studying it and how they see it in the future because they weren't alive. We had a big part in playing that. So I think that was a lot on our minds too, as we had to get it right and we had to make sure people would remember.